Hey there, welcome back to the exam preparation video series for SC-300, Microsoft Identity and Access Administrator. My name is Peter de Tender. I'm a lead Microsoft technical trainer here at Microsoft. This is the third episode out of a total of 4 episodes in this series. In this specific episode, we'll focus on planning and implementing workload identities. We will cover how to plan and implement identities for applications and Azure workloads. Next, plan, implement, and monitor the integration of enterprise applications, followed by plan and implement application registrations, and then last, managing and monitor application access by using Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. Here is a list of all the different skills you may be tested on. These are sometimes referred to as may include, meaning they may or may not be on your exam. This list isn't exhaustive, and while we won't be covering every skill in this video, be sure you are able to perform these skills before taking the exam. If you have been through other episodes in these exam prep series, you already know the guideline to pause the video, grab a screenshot so you have a nice overview at hand of what to study specifically. And this list continues with a few more items to really understand well before sitting for the exam. Let's kick off this episode touching on the different Entra ID entities you can use for applications and Azure workloads. Make sure you see the difference in use case between service principals and managed identities. The first one comes with credentials, the second one doesn't, which makes it a more optimized scenario from a security perspective. But on the other hand, managed identities are specifically for Azure resources, meaning third-party applications can't benefit from using them. Apart from understanding the difference between both, you obviously also need to know how to implement them in Azure. Like this example here, showing you how to link a user-assigned managed identity to an existing Azure App Service resource. And no surprise, spend enough time in Azure CLI command line interface and PowerShell to also be familiar with the command line syntax on how to do this. Once the managed identity is created, it doesn't come with any RBAC roles or permissions, which is obviously a security best practice. But it also means once created and assigned to a resource, you would move to the next step, defining the correct RBAC permissions. And remember, always try to approach it with the least amount of privilege in mind. As mentioned earlier, managed identities can only be used with Azure resources. So how do you interact Entra ID identities with third-party applications? Well, that's where the creation of enterprise applications and performing an app registration comes in. This technically creates a service principal with credentials, or certificates are obviously also possible. You could start from a library of existing business applications, or why not adding your own, which would also something you would do if you build an in-house developed application. As this leans closer to application lifecycle management, and maybe it means you're managing by the development team instead of your IT or security teams, consider allocating Entra ID RBAC roles to your developers in that case, so they can manage the enterprise applications. Make sure for the exam you understand the different permissions granted to an application administrator and a cloud application administrator. A little tip, it has something to do with application proxy settings. So let me take a minute to talk about application proxy a little bit more. In the scenario of having cloud users requiring access to on-prem applications, application proxy would be a great solution. Integrating with Entra ID, it allows you to go through all possible Entra ID security validations, like we talked about in other episodes, multi-factor authentication, conditional access, and the like, before connecting to your on-prem running application. Also remember, you need to install the application proxy connector in the on-prem environment to make all this work. When talking about app registrations and enterprise apps, meaning we're connecting Entra ID to our third-party running applications, we also need to take care of user provisioning, meaning defining what permissions our users will have once they successfully authenticate. This overview here covers the different aspects of user provisioning. Some highlights here: automation is obviously key, followed by governance, monitoring, and auditing as well. Another aspect related to app registrations and enterprise apps is the concept of delegation and consent. Delegation got already positioned earlier when we emphasized on the application administrator or cloud application administrator RBAC roles in Entra ID. Admin consent here refers to allowing users to provide application consent or not. Make sure you know the insights of how the consent process works for users and administrative accounts. And then here it highlights the different key parameters to complete when you're actually creating an app registration using the Entra ID portal. In short, you specify a unique name for the registration in your tenant, identify what kind of authentication you want to provide to users, such as your own directory, a different directory in the same tenant, or also allowing external users to authenticate, like for example, with an Outlook, Hotmail, or other cloud provider identities. And then optionally, you can specify a redirect URI depending on the application use case. Once the application registration process is done, you can then configure the application roles, which you use to assign what the user can do within the application once successfully authenticated by Entra ID. This could be an application reader, application owner, or something similar. Make sure you understand the different security and permission scopes for the provided list of applications. Now, you might think that controlling applications throughout the described process of application registration, enterprise apps, consent, and the like is enough. But let me remind you about the risk of shadow IT, threat protection, information protection, and compliance. Apart from who can use the application, you now also need to manage what data the user can or cannot work with. This is one of the so many scenarios where Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps is beneficial. And last, let me bring you back to the first episode of this series, where I talked about conditional access. Every enterprise application you defined in Entra ID application registrations automatically becomes available as part of the policies and settings in conditional access. Before closing this episode, a last reminder: there are several other tasks you need to undertake as part of the process, which also means they might show up on the exam. Starting with the management of users, groups, and application roles for enterprise applications. Next, spend some time in learning about application collections, how to plan for application registrations, and last, remember, Defender for Cloud Apps has more features than what I mentioned in the pre-last slide. Look into Cloud Apps Discovery, the integration with third-party proxy and firewall logs, and even a bit more. To recap, in this episode, we discussed how to plan and implement identities for applications and Azure workloads, followed by plan, implement, and monitor the integration of enterprise applications. Then we talked about plan and implement application registrations, and then closing with manage and monitor application access by using Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. Remember, this group accounts for 20 to 25% of the exam, so keep that in mind when preparing for the exam. I'd like to thank you for watching episode 3 on planning and implementing workload identities. Obviously, be sure to join us for episode 4, where we cover planning and automating identity governance.